Welcome to Carmen's Corner at carmenerichards.com. My guest today is thriller suspense author Dennis RICCI. Welcome, Dennis.
Thanks, Carmen. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you here. Dennis and I met at a Writing for the Soul conference in 2012. We became critique partners, and since that time, he has completed his debut novel, Perilous Judgment. Just came out through Amazon. I love the cover, and I actually love the first line. I'm a big first line person, so I'm going to read the first line, and then I want you to tell us about your book.
Okay.
Chapter 1, Monday, February 15th, United States Courthouse, downtown Los Angeles, 1:52 p.m. U.S. District Judge Edward Lamport marched into his chambers and swapped his robe for a bulletproof vest. That's fantastic. It really just gets our attention right away and lets us know it's going to be a thriller. So tell us about Perilous Judgment.
The state of Arizona passed a law that was quite controversial, that local law enforcement could stop people they suspected were illegal immigrants and check for papers. So I read the article and talked about the Justice Department filing suit, and it also talked about a little bit about the federal judge who was going to hear the case. And so clearly it was a hot topic at the time. So when I was listing my ideas, one that came to me was, what if that federal judge was smuggling people into the country?
Right.
So that's where it all started. So the first question I had was, well, what would be a federal judge's motivation to do something like that?
Right.
So that's what ended up turning into Perilous Judgment.
I remember that Arizona case, and it's still a hot topic. And I love the dilemma that you put your characters into. Your characters are Edward and Jackie Lamport. Mm-hmm. So tell us what they want and how that collides.
Well, as the story begins, Edward is a relatively new federal judge, only been on the bench for 9 months, and he's assigned a similar case to what happened in Arizona, in the state of California. The citizens voted to pass a law that people who wanted to get state and local government services had to register for a special ID card.
Right.
And the proponents of the law sold it based on, this is an opportunity for people who weren't in the country legally to come out of the shadows and stand up and be counted. Opponents thought it was a backhanded way to oppress those people and scare them away, and so it was highly controversial. So the death threat that you read about in the first sentence is a result of emotions surrounding that case, but also, as is described, I think, on the next page, a previous decision he made to sentence a drug dealer in LA with strong ties to Mexico to death.
Right. Also, Jackie has some high stakes related to Proposition 68 that conflict with Edward. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Jackie is a high-level administrator in the LA Unified School District, and she actually actively campaigned against this proposition. And now her husband has been handed the chore of making a decision on a lawsuit to overturn that law. And he wants to do it right. He wants to do it based on the intent of the Constitution and the validity of the law. But internally, he also doesn't like the law, yet he can't find a reason to overturn it.
It's really interesting because Edward has to come out of his comfort zone to survive in this book. I mean, he's a judge. He sits behind a desk. He reads books. Maybe he golfs, I don't know. But he comes out of his comfort zone in a big way. So tell us a little bit about that.
Edward Lamport's history is as a prosecutor, both in LA County and then as a assistant U.S. attorney, and then as the lead U.S. attorney in Los Angeles before he was appointed to the bench. And so he's a guy who's used to kind of being in the action. But then as a judge, he comes to realize very quickly that the job can be isolating. has to do what he does alone. And that comes with the territory, because judges are appointed for life, and they're supposed to be independent and supposed to, theoretically at least, isolate themselves from all political pressure. Because he's got 2 death threats, the U.S. Marshals strongly encourage him to not only wear a bulletproof vest, but to carry a gun. And he pushes back on that, but eventually agrees. And so right away, we're going to see him learn how to shoot a gun. So that's one of the ways he has to stretch and grow. But the other, as the story unfolds, that he's not used to, he has to kind of get involved in the political muck, deal making, influence peddling, all of that stuff, right, which is totally foreign to him.
Right. And another challenge that he faces, it's not just the death threats, the proposition, but he's also basically goes to war with a drug cartel. So that lesson of the gun in the beginning does come into play at the end. So Dennis, how do you think, with the debate that's going on right now in our country, not just about the president, but about immigration, about gun laws, et cetera, how does your book contribute to society's discussion?
I mean, the reality right now, regardless of what side of the issue you're on, is that we have a lot of laws that regulate immigration, but historically, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration, there's been selective enforcement. Here's this judge in this story who's faced with making and wanting to make a very principled and decision about a law that's been challenged as unconstitutional. At the same time, he has to evaluate whether or not, in order to accomplish something very important to him, which is to save his son's life, he has to break those laws. From a spiritual perspective, the Bible talks about how mercy trumps judgment, and how the greatest expression of love is when we lay down our life for someone else. And so really that's the choice Edward has to face, is the demands of love, i.e. saving his son's life. In his mind, does it outweigh his duty as a member of the government and as a judge to obey the law?
Right. Yeah, I loved how you used, you have the book in 4 parts, which is great. And you used a quote by Abraham Lincoln for that last part. I have always found that mercy bears richer fruits than strict justice. And that is such a delicate balance, not only in society, but for us Christians every day, balancing justice with mercy. And this is definitely a dilemma that Edward is facing when it comes to his son. Edward has a son, and his name is Carlos. Tell us a little bit about Carlos's story and when we meet him and what his objective is.
Carlos is Edward's son from a long ago romance, and there's a whole story behind that. But needless to say, it brought a lot of dishonor. So Carlos has now reemerged into Edward's life. He's 25 years old. He's he's an idealist. He's kind of a prodigy. He's a very intelligent young man, and now he's working in the second largest bank in Mexico.
And his mother accuses him, or not accuses him, but describes him as having reckless faith. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about what is reckless faith, and how does it inform what we believe and how we react?
Well, Carlos is, as I said, he's an idealist, and he sees the corruption in his country that he loves, and that corruption hits very close to home. And he makes an accidental discovery that launches him into this, hey, I've learned something. I can do something about what I'm seeing that I don't like. And so his mother sees that from a distance, because they don't live in the same city. And she watches what her son does and how he risks his life for what he believes in, and from her perspective, is risky and reckless. And at some point, Edward and Alana, Carlos's mother, talk about that. And Edward kind of reflects on that and asks the question, well, isn't that how it's supposed to be? What does that mean? How willing are we, followers of Jesus, to lay down our lives for what's right?
Exactly. That's what I love about that reckless faith thing, is that it shows that he does have a high sense of justice, but he believes in the power of God. He believes that God is able to make a difference. And so he really has a lot of courage throughout the whole book. And I don't want to give it away, but he's a real hero in your book, I think. Edward is the protagonist, I understand, but Carlos is also a real hero. I really like that about him. Talk about Jackie's secret and what that's doing to her and how it's affecting her relationship with Edward.
Well, let's just say both Edward and Jackie have made choices of consequence in their younger years. Mm-hmm. As Edward reveals his to his wife, she reacts how you might expect. But then as she tries to process it all, she soon realizes that there's something, as a choice she'd made as a teenager, that also affected her life with Edward that has never been talked about.
That's right. We're not going to say what it is. Consequential decisions that maybe as a young person you don't think about. As a young person, we don't always think about the consequences of our actions, but sometimes they come back, into play, or to haunt us, or to affect our ongoing relationships. And that's what happens in Perilous Judgment, and I love it. I want to ask you one more quick question. Who should read this book?
Well, I wrote the book for a male reader. The way the story's written, the kind of action, but I also know that there's a lot of women out there who love reading suspense books and thrillers, and even in the political genre. So I know that they would enjoy this story too. And there is that relational element between Edward and Jackie that I know from women who have read the story. They told me that really keeps them engaged, and they really like how that was portrayed. Yeah. So, people who like political thrillers, maybe, books by Joel Rosenberg or Brad Thor or David Baldacci, I think would enjoy this story too. What really drew me to this whole genre was back in the 80s when I started reading Tom Clancy's novels. Yeah. I read The Hunt for Red October, and I was hooked. I read every single one of his stories right up to, I think, the one called Executive Orders, and then I kind of moved on. I like to read a lot of different kinds of books. I've even read Nicholas Sparks. So I just like to read good stories, and I picked up a Nicholas Sparks book a number of years ago because my daughter had it on her shelf, and so I said, well, why not? And I read it, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah. I'm what I call a closet Nicholas Sparks reader, because back when I started reading Nicholas Sparks, it was totally random. I was getting on an airplane, picked up the book out of the airport thing, and I was just hooked, read the whole thing. It's interesting that you say you wrote it for the male reader. Of course you did. I hadn't even thought of that, because as a woman reading the book, I was very engaged by the relationship and sort of the triangle, Edward, Jackie, and Alana, and then of course Carlos in the mix of that too. That was really interesting, and I kept wondering as I was reading, what choice is Edward going to make? And I'm not going to give it away.
It was gratifying when my publisher, Waterfall Press, picked it up. They saw crossover potential.
Yes.
Not just with male and female, but with the person looking for specifically a Christian novel, and those that are just looking for a good political thriller.
Right. That being said, we are going to move on to our next segment and talk about Dennis's writing journey. Dennis, this Perilous Judgment is his debut novel, and he's got a lot to say to people who are interested in writing. What I want to say to you, readers, is go to Amazon.com, pick up Dennis's book. go to DennisRICCI.com, read more about Dennis and what's coming next. We'll ask him about that in a minute. And definitely go and review the book, because that will totally help. This month, up until August 31st, Amazon.com has the Kindle version for $1.99. So you can read Dennis's book right on your Kindle or your iPad for $1.99. So go out and get it. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you, Carmen.